All right. Thank you so much, Katie, and welcome back to Katie. Katie, our wonderful, extraordinary organizer and facilitator of these webinars. She was in Japan right before this, so she was not with us last month. We're so happy to have Katie back. Thank you for coming back, Katie. We would have been very sad if we lost you. Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council webinar series. Happy summer to all of you. I'm assuming we're all experiencing some nice, warm, sunny weather, hopefully. I'm here in Tennessee, lots of rainstorms, but lots of sun. Those of you up north, I hope that you guys are doing well and you're wearing your respirators in those fires right now. I'm joined by not only Katie, but myself. My name's Imagine. I'm your host. We're also joined by Kevin Bolger, the program director, again, another organizational extraordinaire. And today we also have Stephen Robertson. And I'll get into his bio in just a second as we get into our really awesome topic for today. So very happy that Stephen's here. Before I get into Stephen's bio, just a quick update on some events that we've got going on for those of you that are curious and staying up to date on all the hubbubaloo we've got going on with TUFC. Those of you that are signed up for the prescription pruning qualification course, we're really excited to see you in Chattanooga at the end of the month, July 29th through 31st. We also have a Canopy Connections arborist engagement event happening in Chattanooga during that time. So for those of you out near Chattanooga on July 30th at 5:30 p.m., check out our TUFC events if you want to join us for that. It's a great social hour to get around and hang out with arborists. We've also got the ISA Certified Arborist Prep course happening here in Nashville on August 26th through 28th. So if you want to join that, registration's open. And then beyond that, we've got our conference coming up at the end of October, October 29th and 30th. So if you want to come, join us, say hi to everybody, please go ahead and take a look at our events page and we'll go from there. Hopefully we get to see all of your wonderful faces. Katie, do you want to do your CEU thing and then I'll get into Stephen's intro?
Yes, I will. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This webinar has been approved for ISA CEUs. If you are here to receive those CEUs, please make sure that you are registered and that you've paid the $10 fee to get credit. If you are a TUFC member, you do not have to pay. Also, if you're just a general attendee and you are just interested in joining this webinar, you don't have to worry about making a payment. At the very end of the webinar, we will pop up a QR code for you to verify your attendance. If you're not able to scan the QR code, we'll also put a link in the chat that you can use to verify it, and that just helps us in making sure everyone who registered also attended the webinar so that we can send that information to ISA for those CEUs. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put those in the chat, and we will get to those at the end during our Q&A portion. And I think that's it.
Groovy. Okay. Thank you so much, Katie. And again, I'm going to give you an intro on our really awesome speaker for today. So first things first, Daniel Levitt is attending this call. So Daniel, he listened to a podcast called In Defense of Plants, and he heard this amazing speaker discuss pollinators in this really specific niche of moths and nocturnal pollination. And he's like, hey, we should absolutely have this guy on to talk about this really interesting subject. So thanks, Daniel, for the plug, man. We are really excited to have him here because we don't usually talk about subjects this niche, and I would say very interesting this week, especially, or this month. Today we are joined by, is it Dr. Because you're a PhD, it's Dr. Stephen Robertson, correct? Okay, Dr. Stephen Robertson has generously decided to join us today. He's going to be talking about the dark work of nocturnal moth pollinators. Now, just a quick synopsis of your speaker today. Dr. Stephen Robertson grew up in a military family, and the frequent moves throughout his childhood exposed him to a wide variety of ecosystems and habitats. These experiences sparked a lifelong fascination with the natural world. He earned both his bachelor's and master's degree in biology from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock before completing a doctorate in entomology at the University of Arkansas as well, where he studied moth pollination. Today, Stephen serves as the pesticide education field specialist for South Dakota State University, where he educates pesticide applicators on legal, safe, and effective use of pesticides and supports certification training programs. While his passion for ecology and conservation remains strong, he now enjoys exploring those interests without the pressures of academic deadlines, as we talked about right before we brought you all in, and research obligations. But Stephen, Dr. Stephen Robertson, if you'd like to take it away, get your PowerPoint shared, we are so happy to have you here today.
That's a great introduction. I'm excited to be here. Let's make sure this works the way that it's supposed to. Here we go. You guys see in the presentation and not presenter view?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So as it was mentioned, my name is Stephen Robertson. I am the pesticide educator. It's a field specialist position here in South Dakota State. And I work with SDSU Extension. And while my focus for research was in conservation, pollination, and the actual listing of species in several places. It was really nice to sort of move away from research. There's a lot of pressure, you guys, in production, in the professor realm and in the research realm. So much so that I think a lot of those individuals are poorly mistreated. So whenever you have extension agents that are also professors, give them the time of day, give them the respect. They put in the work, they put in the effort, and I can tell you that it's not an easy job and it's often thankless. So the efforts that you can help them with is building their morale, boosting them, supporting them, and allowing them to do their work. So today we're going to talk about nocturnal pollination and fruit. I labeled this the dark work of nocturnal pollinators because, as you can imagine, these moths are actually active at night. And so what we're looking at is nocturnal pollination, which is super exciting. It's a completely unique realm. Most people focus on diurnal pollination, and I think that sort of bias has allowed us, or actually forced us, to miss out on something that's really incredibly important, not just for fruits and agricultural production, but we're finding it more large in ecosystems as well. So let's just cover what pollination is. Very simple, right? We all kind of know what this is. It's just the transfer of pollen or the genetic material from a male part of a plant to the female reproductive tissues that then support the growth of ovules and eggs into seeds. This affects agriculture. About 2/3 of the agriculture, we'll look at this a little bit later, but about 2/3 of the agricultural plants that we grow are dependent on pollinators to one extent, some extent or another. Oftentimes it's pretty dependent. Now we have several different types of pollination. This one we'll call abiotic pollination. Essentially what we're talking about is rain, wind, or a non-biological life form that's transferring that pollen again from the male tissue to the female parts. So we're going from the stamen to the pistil, carrying that pollen over. Most abiotic pollination is going to be done by wind. And so for you guys, pine trees, that's wind pollination. When those pines bloom, what happens? That pollen gets everywhere. It's one of the primary sources of allergies. It also gets all over our cars and houses and everything else. But with so much of it, wind's enough to be able to carry that over at a titer that's enough to create seeds and eggs and seeds. And this for agriculture oftentimes refers to our grains, our oats, wheat, some of our rye. You know, these are not pollinator dependent. They're often wind pollinated. While they receive benefit from biotic pollination, it's minimal. Really, what we're talking about there is just the wind. Now, when we get into biotic pollination, this is where pollinators come in. We're actually talking about a living animal that transfers. They visit a flower, they collect some of the pollen, they transfer it to something else. We often think of bees when we're thinking about this, but as we know, if you guys have done anything in pollination, looking into bats are important, hummingbirds are common visitors of flowers. We got butterflies and moths, even lizards in some cases that feed on nectar can be sources of pollination. And again, in agriculture, we're talking about a heck of a lot. Almost all of our fruits and vegetables, I know I've got a potato up here, that is not pollinator dependent because we reproduce those mostly by tubers. But for reproduction, almost all of these require pollination, biotic, abiotic, or biotic pollination. There are other sources of reproduction in plants that need or require, in order to go through that sexual reproduction, they still require and go through that flowering stage and are biotically pollinated. But for the agricultural sake, a lot of these plants, like potatoes, strawberries, we can reproduce them in a completely different way. So we don't necessarily need to have a seed, and in often cases, we don't start them from seed. So, and there's a way to think about this when we're talking about pollination. Who needs that biotic pollination? Who needs pollinators? Well, one, if you're wind pollinated, of course you don't necessarily need pollinators. Again, benefit but not needed. But there are also situations even within those dependent plants that reduce their dependency on pollinators. We're talking about self-fertile or selfing. These are plants that within the same plant, they can fertilize themselves. They're somewhat asexual, but they do require the transfer of pollen, again, from that pistil to or from the stamen to the pistil. And it's real simple. For selfing from one flower to the next, even within the same flower, can often result in a successful pollination and the development of fruit. There are peaches, apples, grapes, that are strongly self-fertile, and so they don't necessarily need pollinators, and they still produce quality, high quality fruit at lower rates. Tart cherries are also an example of self-fertile. And so we end up developing this scale of dependency across the board. And so when we think about it, we've got those that are completely independent, all the way to those that are absolutely dependent on pollination. And this is a sort of scale here that kind of shows we've got, you know, wheat here, not a big deal. Oats, grains, they don't necessarily need it. They're wind pollinated. Potatoes, we can chop a tuber in half and grow a new plant. This Jatropha circus, this fuel plant that I've got down here, it does require biotic pollination, but less so because it's also wind pollinated to a slight extent. And then it just keeps going coffee to watermelon. Watermelon is entirely dependent, it will not generate fruit unless you have pollinators. And so and this has changed a little bit. We now have hemp that's in here. We've got some other minor crops that are kind of taking a place in modern and more prominent agricultural positions. But here we're looking at this is from 2007. So again, a little bit out of date. But from our 124 leading global crops, about 70% are entirely pollinator dependent. We've got 28 crops, about 23% that are pollinator independent. But most of the crops that we grow are in fact pollinator dependent. Now, how that plays out is a little bit different because we grow a heck of a lot more grain than we grow our specialty crops. And so it turns out most of our agricultural production does not necessarily require pollinators, but there is a very important sector of agriculture that is absolutely dependent on that pollinator activity. So let's talk about what makes a good pollinator. I'm sure you guys could probably synthesize this on your own just by thinking of what matters, but let's walk you through it. How do we go from flower to fruit? That's the goal, right? We want to go from a flower, which is the potential source for fruit production, to the fruit itself, which is oftentimes our marketable source of income. First thing we need, especially when it comes to biotic pollination, right? And that's what we're talking about here. We need a biotic pollinator. In this case, let's talk about the honeybee. It's the most recognizable, and it's probably the most prolific and most important pollinator on the globe. Don't let me mince my words. I'm not here to say moths are the best. They're close, but I am going to say that honeybees are probably the most important and best pollinators, especially for our agriculture and the way that we produce. So we need a pollinator. It has to visit a flower. So it has to be attracted to that flower. It has to be interested in that flower. When we're talking about a self-infertile or something that has to necessarily reproduce or transfer that pollen to a different plant, we have to have that pollen transfer. So that floral visitor has to, again, be attracted, has to pick up the pollen, and it has to carry that pollen to another flower in order to reproduce or create fruit. Then we get to the apple. But that's not the end of the story, right? Because we don't just want one apple. One apple is, hey, that's a good snack, but we're not selling that apple. We're selling a tree of apples. So it's really important that we look at our total fruit set rather than, hey, I got an apple, so we had successful pollination. And so our fourth character that I think is really important is abundance. The more bees that we have, the more pollinators that we have visiting flowers and transferring that pollen, the more flowers that we can actually pollinate and generate into the apples. So here we've got it, pollen uptake again, pollen transfer. Now we've got a huge team of them, and now we've got a huge just tree filled with apples. Now that's something we can use to market and actually sell. But there's one other piece of the puzzle that I think is oftentimes missed. So imagine a fruit, and this is broad, right? So we're going to make some generalizations here. This doesn't play out exactly the way that I'm showing it, but it is important to sort of have a framework of understanding so we recognize the value of pollinators and how they contribute. Consistency and reliability. So let's think about a tree that only blooms in March. And we'll just say it's the entire month of March. Well, if we have a pollinator that in one year, say it comes a month after, and the next year it doesn't even show up, and then the year after we have two instances of it, one's during bloom and one's outside of bloom. They could be the most abundant pollinator. They could be the most effective pollinator, but if they're not at the time of the game, if they're not showing up when the game's being played, they are not pollinators of that plant. And so again, it's really important to sort of consider, when are things blooming? When are these pollinators active? Can they actually contribute? And so when we're thinking about other pollinators, this would be a potentially decent pollinator. Well, we've got a difference of visitation here across the years. We still have a prominent visitation during the bloom period. A quality pollinator will be active even sporadically, even a little bit randomly, but they're present when the game's being played and they're visiting, they're transferring. It may be minor, but what their contributions are can collectively become quite large, which we'll see. Let's talk about the primary pollinators. The reason I say Western honeybees, the Apis mellifera, these are the single most important pollinator because of the way we farm them. They are companions. We farm them. We transport them around into areas that may lack pollinators or may need additional assistance in order to have a strong fruit set. So we can carry these guys all over the place. You guys remember this year we actually had an accident. I think it was some 500,000 bees were lost in, gosh, I want to say it was Utah. Truck crashed and all those bees got out. And if you saw, there were multiple different swarms all over the place, and they were trying to get out there and recapture them and put them back into their boxes. Hopefully that worked out. I guarantee they lost quite a few. So a piece of this puzzle is we've got one pollinator. A single species oftentimes has very specific attractants. And so they're going to be attracted to the same flowers. Okay, so what is it? Is it the smell of the flower? Is it the color of the flower? What are the aspects? There are several that actually contribute to a pollinator visitation, but they're oftentimes, again, going to be, because they're from the same species, their cues are oftentimes similar. So they visit a very specific subset of the flowers that are available to them. Have another species come in, they visit a different subset. They may revisit some of the flowers that were previously visited, but they visit a different, their attractions are different. So they visit a different subset of flowers. Likewise, with moths, they'll visit a completely different set of flowers as well. Maybe they've been visited before, and so those volatile compounds that are cues to, hey, this is rich, maybe those aren't there anymore because the bees already sucked it up, or a fly has come in and sucked up all that delicious nectar. And so there are sensors, there are ways that these animals can detect it, and then the team of individuals working in concert actually produces the best fruit set, the best reproductive value. So diverse communities are incredibly important. We've got loads of different pollinators that we've recognized. That top row, all bees. We're familiar with the bees more so. Heliconius, this is a very important pollinator of passion fruit, but they are good pollinators. We got syrphids flies, and we have sphingid moths. Those are probably some of the more recognizable Lepidoptera and Diptera, but there are others, plenty of others. And one of the biggest concerns that we have for pollinators right now is the dramatic decline in numbers. These are from what you're seeing right now are 2020 numbers on the far right. But essentially what's going on is that we're losing our pollinators to disease. We're losing our pollinators to potential contamination with pesticides. We're losing our pollinators to agricultural production and development, as well as urban development. And we'll talk about the causes for it. But what it amounts to is that we've lost some. It's a lot, 20% or more. And it depends on the species, but we've lost a lot of our pollinator power because of the way that we do our normal operations. So this you can see in Europe here, we've got a loss upwards of 50% during the 2020 season, which is pretty bad. 2018, 2019 season. In 2020, 2021, we were losing in some places 75%. In some places, we were losing. You see in South Dakota, it shows none. That's not the case. We actually lost close to 35% that year. And so it's pretty dramatic. And actually, we had our worst year for declines this past year, 2024 to 2025. I believe the numbers were broadly on average 60% across the country. Again, a lot of that's owed to the varroa mite. It is a pest of bees that slides in between their cuticle and it sucks up their hemolymph, but primarily what it's doing is feeding on the fats. And so these animals don't have the reserves to be able to overwinter. It's super problematic. Bumblebees are also a serious problem. We've got one on here, Bombus affinis. It's not the only one, but that is an endangered species. Bombus pennsylvanicus, that's our American bumblebee. That one has dropped about what we think 90% in the last 30 years. And there's a push to make that one on the at least threatened list. That's a problem species that we're concerned about. And if you guys know about pennsylvanicus, you can find it almost ubiquitously across most of the United States. It's one of the common bugs that we used to see, and those numbers have declined dramatically. And part of the reason that we're concerned about this is the change in agriculture. So as you can see here, what this is showing, and I'll just point it out, this orange is basically the crops that we have or the dependence that we have on pollinators. Since 1981, the 1980s, it has spiked up about 60%. And so our we've got a 60% increase in our pollinator dependency. Now, part of that is because the agriculture of those farmers, they want that increased price point. Those specialty crops bring in more money. They can be a little bit more work, but they definitely bring in a heck of a lot more money than the grains, the soy, the corn, the wheat that we might grow. And then what we're seeing is that the area of farming is actually it's going up as well, but what we're seeing is most of that area is being devoted to that those dependent crops. And what we're seeing in diversity, it's while this has increased like 20%, the diversity is actually, I would say, largely on the decline. Now we are introducing new ways of growing, new ways of farming that are including greater diversity, but diversity is a very serious issue. The greater diversity we have in plants, the greater diversity we have in the insect community that we'll have there, including pollinators. But we see richness and evenness. Terrible. Those are awful numbers. That basically means that we're operating monocultures. Even when we're talking about specialty crops, we're talking about monocultures. Monoculture cropping is the bane of diversity. We strip everything else. We have one target in mind. We grow and care only about that one plant. While that benefits the pests of those plants and those that rely on that plant, it could be potentially problematic. We see those pest species blow up. When we grow a highly concentrated area of nothing but palm oil, palm pests are going to show up. You just made a smorgasbord. You have given them everything they need in a very compact area, and so what do we have to do? We have to put out pesticides. When we put out pesticides, what does that do? It affects our pollinators, it affects our insect communities because a lot of those things are not selective. And this is another serious problem. In order to get to that agriculture, again, we strip the land. We burn it, we hack slash it, we get through there, we remove everything, and then we plant corn, and that's the only thing that we plant. And again, monoculturing is the bane of diversity, and diversity is key for pollination. Habitat fragmentation is another big one. We're talking about urbanization, we're talking about even agricultural development. We are talking about stripping that habitat. And what that does is those habitats that remain, maybe we can't work it, maybe it's next to a riverbed, but that remains a small fragment of the natural habitat that previously existed. And you can see the species move themselves into those areas, and that connectivity is gone. They now have to fly 2 miles to find something that is approximate to their favored conditions where they might find a reproductive adult individual. And that span, that disconnection, it makes it really hard for those things to thrive and continue to do so. It also bottlenecks their genetics. There's several problems with the way that we approach things. We are looking at corridors and how to make habitat connectivity a little bit better, but it's still a problem broadly. And again, pesticide usage, when you monoculture, you're going to just attract those pests. When they come in, those people rely on that. That's their livelihood. And so they do have to put out some kind of protection in order to make sure that they can continue to live. But problem is, again, lack of selectivity. It's going to affect other insects. So and this is one of my favorite graphs. I know it's a little confusing. So what you're seeing on the right side of this circle is the evolution of moths. You can see butterflies pop here. This is the orange monophyletic group of rhopalid. These are your butterflies. The rest of these are moths, and on this side are angiosperms or our flowering plants. And so we can see that we're actually collecting pollen from the Carboniferous, from the Permian, from the Triassic. If you look at where moths originated, their need for angiosperms, that's angiospermivora, that's animals that feed on angiosperms. Moths pop out way back here, and if you can see it right here, it's actually going to be in the Permian Triassic area. So we think about 250 million years ago, moths had evolved the ability to feed on plant parts, as well as they're starting to nectar. So these are mandibulate moths. They're still feeding on whole foods, but they're starting to shift. And we can see that change in the development of the proboscis, which comes later. That's their long feeding tube. Bees didn't even pop up until about 130 million years ago. And so we've got a span here between the Permian Triassic and 120, 130 million years ago, it's about 120 million years, where moths are the primary associate of angiosperms. And we could see the radiation of angiosperms during that moth radiation. They expanded, they exploded. It became the primary method for reproduction. Super cool relationship. I strongly advise, like, go read this paper. It is shocking how much those moths actually contribute, or the potential relationship between moths and angiosperms. So here we've got some numbers. This is from 2017. This has changed. We've actually described more species. I'll show you the new numbers here in just a second, but I just want to highlight one thing. So moths, at the time, we had described about 123, 124,000 species. Bees, a measly 17,000. So again, we're talking about diversity. We're talking about abundance. If we're just looking at moths, we're just looking at bees, moths are far more diverse and they are far more abundant than bees are. So when we're talking about the characters that make good pollinators, moths already stand out, and those two characters, they stand out well and above the rest of the groups. Now we know bees, we have about 20,000 described species of bees, but moths and butterflies, actually just moths, about 160,000 species. And so if you remember the numbers here, we're talking about 123 and 17 to 20, and then 123 to 160. And we still think there are several thousand species of moths. We think it's probably 200, 250. I think 250 is an exaggeration. That said, we have a heck of a lot of moths left to discover, left to describe. And the really cool thing about moths is they've got some attributes that really make them good at collecting and carrying pollen. Remember, pollen transfer is a really important thing. They love flowers. They have proboscis. They feed almost exclusively on nectar. They use that to suck up other liquids, like we call it puddling. They're soaking up salts and minerals from puddles of water that have sat in the soil. But all this hair is excellent. It's one of the characters or the attributes of bees that make them so good about carrying. They have these split branched hairs. Well, if we look at the scales on moths and butterflies, there's such a diversity here, and it's so hairy that they are picking up loads of pollen. You can see pollen grains here on top of the head of this animal. This is actually the proboscis underneath. Sorry, this is an animal turned upside down, and you can see this guy is actually has just a bunch of pollen on the wings and on the face. Clearly visited a flower. That flower stuck all of its pollen onto it. And moths are attracted to flowers. This is a project that I had started, and this is actually one of the things that clued me in. I was trying to build a trap that was very effective at isolating the pollinators and not bringing in other things. The problem I ran into is that it was too good. I worried that I was doing extermination collections in the framework of anything that was in a very wide area was coming in and I was collecting. I ended up getting way more moths than I expected. I was after bees. I got way more moths, which kind of clued me in, like, hey, what's going on in the evening? Because I would leave these traps out for 24 hours. And so it kind of gave me this idea, like maybe I should be looking at something else. I had added these chemicals, benzyl acetate, linalool. There's a couple other that I added in concoction, sort of attract these things. These are really common floral um, organic compounds, just volatile organics. Moths also have the ability to see at night to a level that we don't fully understand. So in day, of course, they get the full light vision, and they have these, call them blinders. They're actually part of the eye that you can't see. So here's the exterior of the eyeball. These are the things that create the illusion of a pupil. They don't actually have pupils. It's just where the light goes in and it doesn't refract back into our eyes. So it kind of looks like they got pupils. They don't. And so they actually have these on the sides. Consider them blinders. And so they can stretch and shrink those as needed. In the evening, what they do is they'll actually shrink those to allow more light to come in and hit on these rods where they actually pick up the light. And it's called summation. And it could be spatial summation, which is what this is. So they actually get as much light as they possibly can in order to generate an image, or a temporal summation, which means that as they move, they wait for that signal. They build that signal to a certain threshold before their brain receives it, interprets it. And what it amounts to is they can see excellently at night. They can see, at least some species we know of can see color at night, and they can very clearly distinguish flowers. They're not great flyers. They're still clumsy, but nonetheless, they are great at recognizing where those flowers are and how to get to them. And I just want to get into some of the other attributes that make them good pollinators. One, and we know this from a study with Silene latifolia, this is white campion, if you guys are familiar. It's a decent plant, cool plant. Um, there's a species that is what we call a brood pollinator. What they do is they pollinate and then they'll lay their eggs in the seed pod in order for their larvae to feed on the seeds and develop. And we see that that's pretty common, and that makes them maybe less good at pollination, or it makes them really good, and then they actually destroy some of their work, which maybe is negative for the plant itself. Sorry if you see me keep doing this. My light is on a sensor, and it shuts off if I don't poke my hand out. Um, and we know that pollination from moths is actually effectual in multiple habitats. We've seen a very strong contribution to tropical lowland forest, to Sonoran desert. We found a very significant contribution of moth pollination. And what's interesting, and what I showed in the last slide, is that a lot of the animals that we're talking about, or what we're going to talk about, actually overwinter in Mexico. And as they move up with those southerly winds that come in the spring, they're doing pollination across the board. So we could have an individual that pollinates in Arkansas, which I'm pretty sure we did, and then they move on to Pennsylvania and they do pollination there, and then to New York and they're pollinating there. These animals sometimes live for 2 months. And I can tell you that window of migration, it's a very short period. And they contribute again to a lot of different types of gardens. Their effect has been strong across these multiple habitats. And those are just the ones that we've studied. I guarantee you, you start to look in other habitats, they're going to be very important there as well. And just like the bees, our moth populations are declining. We've seen some huge losses in understory feeding moths in New Jersey. In the Northeast, large body moths seem to be on a decline. Those are your sphingids, your saturniids, some of the larger animals that come through. And as a whole, we're just losing a lot of the bigger ones. We're actually probably losing some of the smaller ones as well, but those aren't as closely watched and they're a lot harder to observe. And the expertise for micromoths is minimal. Micromoths are wingspans less than 10 millimeters. The expertise available in the United States, I want to say there's probably like 10 people that focus on micromoths. So it's kind of a unstudied area. Here we've got some more numbers from Europe. United Kingdom's experienced losses. Netherlands reported huge losses, 73% decreasing in distribution and abundance. That's numbers. So how many species are actually experiencing decline? It's dramatic. It is dramatic. And there's a good reason for it. A lot of these moths are pests of our agriculture. And you'll see as I go through some of the ones that I point out as being potentially good pollinators of trees and fruit ag. Well, it turns out they love the grain. They love the grasses. They will attack corn. They will go after a lot of the things that are cash crops for the United States. And we already talked about what happens when a pest gets into a place of agriculture. So they're getting attacked in multiple ways, not only from development, but also their local ranges are being changed. And of course, where they find themselves blowing up in population and experience, oh, this is great, they're getting attacked pretty heavily. I want to go through some very specific examples, just real quickly. Just want to show you. Aquilaria crasna. This is a type of fruit plant. We use it mostly for biofuels, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while. But you can see hand pollination had an effect. Open pollination had an effect. Moth pollination was actually important, so it actually contributed. And the way that they did this was oftentimes through exclusions. We'll talk about my methods as I go, and it's very similar to what has already been done. For Jatropha surcus, they found Lepidoptera being one of the most important. This is used for biofuel. One of the most important contributors is this guy. It's a type of butterfly. It's an imphalid butterfly. This is a noctuid moth, a rebid moth, sorry. And what we find is that our nocturnal pollination was actually pretty good for fruit set, meaning we set fruit. But if you know anything about reproduction in plants, the number of seeds is also important. So you often see seed numbers per capsule, and we can see that no significant difference between nocturnal and diurnal animals. Low bush blueberry. If you guys like fruit, this is one of my favorite. High bush blueberries is actually one of my favorite fruits. Low bush is pretty good. That said, they did a study in Canada for low bush blueberry, and they found that actually the contributions for those that were open only at night, again, strong contributions from moth pollinators. And again, I'm not saying that moths are the best pollinators, but that contribution cannot be denied. We're talking about 20% more than that added to the overall fruit set. When you're talking about dollars and cents, the more fruit you have, the better it is. And they identified Galachiid, Tortricid, and Geometrid. I identified a completely different family as being extremely important for fruit, even for blueberries. But It all depends on where you are when you do the study and what's showing up at the time, right? Cucurbits also have experienced incredible. In fact, in this case, the diurnals actually prove to be the most effective pollinators in a lot of the cucurbits. And we can see that if you guys grow watermelon or if you grow any kind of cucumber, moths are primary visitors. Bees do get in there, bumblebees, but these flowers are awfully big, and so bees have to travel a heck of a lot of ways in order to collect enough pollen. There are a lot better resources for them. Let's get into my research. And I had two essential lines of questioning. One, I wanted to know, do nocturnal pollinators, do they pollinate at all? Are they even there? Does it matter? Is this worthy of study? And then if they do, which ones? How many? When do they come? That let's detail it out. Are they actually good at it, or is it just one every 1 month? Remember the consistency, the presence, being there when the game's being played. Is that going on? And so I looked at three different fruit plants. I looked at muscadine grapes, which are classically known as self-fertile. They don't need pollinators. They're pollinators, somewhat pollinator independent. Red Haven peaches, which they do have some self-fertile, but there's a little bit where they benefit from visitation. And then apples, one variety was self-fertile, and then the other variety was completely pollinator dependent, so self-infertile, needed that transfer of pollen. Here's where I did it. Northwest Arkansas at the Milo J. Schultz Research and Ag Extension Center. These are my apples in green. These are my muscadine grapes in purple. And then I did the Agricultural Fruit Research Station in Clarksville. And these are the peaches that I ran into. So we're talking about small plots, right? But I can tell you that where I was in small areas of animals being, I saw loads of evidence of otherwise. In fact, one of my favorite stories is one of the reasons that clued me in. Sure, I was catching moths, but then I had a buddy tell me that a wild peach tree had grown on a wildlife management area in Arkansas. I went out there and checked it, went out there around sunset, and I saw over 1,000 moths visit this thing within 30 minutes. That was enough for me to recognize, like, oh my gosh, this could be that swarm of animals is worth exploring. So how do we do this kind of research? In order to figure out which one's doing the job, is it diurnal, nocturnal? We have to have two controls, right? We have to have completely closed control, nothing can ever visit, completely open control, everything can visit, just to show the variation. Are we within the variation? And then we show diurnal pollinators, so we exclude things at night, allow only diurnal pollinators to get there. And then we have nocturnal pollinators, exclude during the day, leave it open at night. Did some analysis. We won't talk about the analysis. You guys don't really care much about that. Same thing with muscadine grapes. Again, monoecious, self-infertile, or it's a self-fertile, sorry. Monoecious, so it requires some level, but we think it's wind pollinated. So we're not necessarily interested, or we weren't sure how well that played out. But Dr. Worthington was interested in exploring that aspect. With muscadine grapes, we saw no difference across the board. May as well just leave it out there. Moths aren't really contributing as much as we might want, and the bees also don't contribute enough. Significantly increase that fruit production beyond just being open. Peaches, that's another one. Very important plant. You guys probably are familiar. I know there's a huge production of peaches. Oftentimes for agriculture, we develop and we grow those non-showy flowers. That's this up here. Oftentimes these non-showy flowers tend to be a bit more fragrant. They also tend to be more pollinator dependent. So it depends on the species, but the one that we used was Red Haven, again, self-fertile, but benefits from. And so what we see is that when we close off, and this was surprising, and I'll show you some pictures that really kind of support this. But what we see is that nocturnal pollinators actually contributed significantly more than diurnal pollinators, and were slightly above closed and open. So closed and open, it's possible that during closed, as I was putting the bag on there, I could have pollinated it. They're self-fertile, so they can fertilize within the flower itself. It's possible that it pollinated itself. But why then would diurnal pollinators potentially cause reduction? It could be, and this is just a theory. Bees feed on nectar or feed on pollen primarily, so they're collecting that pollen. They don't want to lose any. They do when they visit flowers. There's a small percentage that gets transferred, but their objective is to collect as much of that pollen as they can. And in doing so, of course, they're going to steal some of that pollen that could self-fertilize. This is in peaches. I wanted to point out the view here. So this is Methenma unipuncta. It's the true armyworm. And Paradroma saucea, the black cutworm. two very important pests of row crops, particularly corn and our grains. And so you can see here, there's three moths visiting three different flowers here. There are five moths in this picture. You can barely see the other one, I think, over here. Sorry, it's going to be just over here, just past the picture. But we've got evidence that in numbers, these animals are visiting these flowers. And I can say I visited a heck of a lot of trees, try to get these pictures. This was not an uncommon scene. These are my best pictures, but not uncommon to see that number. I also did it in apples. There are a heck of a lot of varieties grown worldwide. A lot of them are self-fertile, but pollinator dependence varies. Again, we ran it in 2017. I ran it on self-fertile, and then 2018 I ran it on Enterprise, which is a self-infertile variety. Here are the numbers that we get. So in 2017, one, a 40% fruit set. That's outrageous. You don't get that with apples. You don't want that with apples. That much fruit is going to break branches. So we're really looking for a maximum of about 10% fruit set. It's really what we're looking for to be a successful. And so clearly the moths have by themselves increased just when it's fully open or when it's fully closed, not allowed to be exposed to the various different pollination sources. Moth pollinators actually increased that significantly. Diurnal pollinators did better, and combined with that open set, we actually see that it goes up just a little bit. It's almost additive, which I thought was interesting. When we're talking about 2018, remember that's a self-infertile variety, so pollen had to be transferred. We actually see that the contribution of nocturnal pollinators was the same, statistically the same as the diurnal and same as the open. And so we're talking about contributions to the similar level as all diurnal pollinators, all bees, all flies, all beetles that visit during the day. Nocturnal pollinators, primarily moths, are doing just as much. Incredible. Well, we got to look at the seed set too, right? We got to look at likelihood. How likely is it for a flower within a cluster to be pollinated? Well, when it comes to nocturnal and diurnal, those are the same again in 2017 or 2018. And then, of course, we looked at seed set. And we find that, hey, nocturnal pollinators are actually contributing to seed set as well. In some cases, increasing or enhancing seed set, which suggests that their pollen transfer is maybe more efficient. And so I wanted to ask, like, okay, well, who's visiting? How many of them? When are they visiting? So I ended up finding about 1,088 species overall. That's fantastic. That's a huge number. Not all of those are visiting, and I didn't catch those every single year. 19 species captured every single year, and we had a total of 9 nights with 836 individuals. So about 93 per night visiting, which is nice. That's the capture rate. That's not the visitation rate, but we have that many that we actually captured in our bucket traps. Here's the breakdown. You can see here, noctuids are by and far the most important, or the largest group. Tortricids, they tend to be pests. In fact, the ones that I was seeing were pests of apples. No surprises there. Similarly with crambid, although crambid turned out to be a potential very important source of pollination, as well as arebids, geometrids, skelecheids, graciliarids, pyralids, sphingids, and cinnaeids. When we look at the abundance and diversity, we can see there was variation across the year. Important thing there is that it changes each year for moth numbers. That's to be expected. But what I thought was interesting is that the night depended. So if you've got a bright sunny day, diurnal pollinators are probably going to be active. Maybe not in the same numbers, but for nocturnal pollinators, very specific conditions. You can see there were several nights where I caught nothing, absolutely nothing. And yet there were some nights that I had such abundance that it was very hard to keep up with. So it differed widely. I happen to think it has something to do with the south winds, their migration when they're moving through, and those environmental conditions that really assist them with that. I broke it down by time, and so what we see, they visit, and this is important for management. These nocturnal moths are actually most active in the first 2 hours of the evening. That's when I'm seeing the most moths and the greatest abundance, greatest diversity, and things kind of taper off, but we have another emergence around midnight, 1, 2 o'clock. And so what that means is when you're trying to avoid pollinators, diurnal pollinators, and you're told on a pesticide label, spray in the evening. Well, that's great for diurnal pollinators, but because of our bias, because of the attention that we've unfortunately bottlenecked ourselves, we put on those horse glasses, we've missed out on a potentially really important contributor to pollination because we're advising people, hey, spray the moths because those aren't important, when my research suggests something entirely different. There may be some policy review necessary. When we look at abundance again, we're looking at mostly floral visitors, which I thought was really important. You're talking about during a bloom period, what's going to be most likely to be there? Turns out it's going to be the floral visitors, the pests and the unknown, which sometimes the unknown we just haven't described. In some cases, they're both pests and pollinator or floral visitors. Remember, floral visitation doesn't mean pollinator. It could just mean they're getting a drink. They have to transfer it. And again, here we're looking at basically a breakdown of the abundance by species. Udea rubigalis, it's pyralid. Paradromastosia, Methinema unipuncta, those are both noctuids. Their abundance was high consistently. These are pictures of those animals. You can see this is a breakdown by species per hour. And so we actually have Udea rubigalis, its highest visitation was that first hour after sunset. Paradromastosia, second hour. And this Methinema unipuncta turned out 2 to 3 o'clock were the most abundant period for them. That's interesting. That separation creates nice little niches where they could do individual species contributions at levels that were previously unknown. Other animals that I found are beetles. Mosquitoes actually visited. This is one of my favorite pictures because I have a mosquito visiting and actually taking a nectar drink. You hear that they do that, but actually seeing it, that was exciting. We have neuropterans here. I think they're feeding on the pollen. I don't think they're actually transferring it. So I think in some of these cases, they're not actually doing much as far as pollination is concerned. I looked a little bit at blueberries. This is a distribution of animals I found on blueberry. That's up at the top and bottom here. This is on plum, so we are actually seeing moths visit plum as well. Working on fruit research farm, really nice and being able to just kind of dip out and say, well, what about this? And so you can see 7 different species here of moths visiting blueberries. I know they had a contributory effect. I didn't study those, but I'm sure that they did. Importantly, going forward, I think we need to look at what subtype of flowers are they visiting? Is it complementary, or does it potentially conflict with what the bees are getting out of it? So are they doing the same job, or are they adding to the job that's already been done? Real quick, ooh, I want to play this. I just want you to see kind of what this is a video from a professor that after I'd started doing the research, they started looking into it. Just observations. All of those are moths. This is shortly before sundown. I guarantee most of those are Methinema unipuncta. That's that true armyworm. Numbers. Those are numbers that can easily pollinate large swaths of plant. It's a cherry tree. It's an ornamental cherry tree that was in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Super exciting. List of people that I have to acknowledge. I'm not going to go through every single one. I just want to point out the people. My faculty, my advising faculty, Dr. Galling, Weedman, Westerman, Joshi, Garcia. Unfortunately, we lost Dr. Garcia. She's pictured here a couple years ago. Kind of dramatic for me. It felt really terrible. But literature cited. I'm happy to share this. Don't worry about looking into it. But before I end, I want to do real quick. Guys, get out there and moth. I was going to make this dramatic, but just get out there and moth. So you need a white sheet, a black light, a mercury vapor lamp if you've got one. Mercury vapor can be a little bit overkill. It's hard to manage. It gets very hot. Don't ever look at it straight. You can blind yourself with mercury vapor. Be careful with it. Black lights right next to a sheet. Have a transporting source. In fact, these car batteries, one of the nights that I was out, I left my lights on inside the truck. A lot of times I just hung out in the truck while I was doing research. Truck died, but I had black lights. So I was actually able to take the battery that I was using for research, jumpstart my vehicle with a fresh battery, and end up having to change the car battery. But it was just, hey, nice extra source of energy. This is the sort of thing that you can expect from this. This is the single best sheet that I've ever seen for mothing. I've never seen anything like that. I can tell you that anytime close, like with this, you're getting hit in the face by a lot of bugs, but it's so cool to just get out there and see what is out there. And of course, everybody's attracted to the big ones. If you get a chance, check out the small ones. Oftentimes, you'll see a lot of the same species, but if you look really close, some of those small ones are absolutely gorgeous, and you just don't get to see them that often. But I recommend if you're going to do this, get a field guide. Peterson's my favorite. very good descriptions of animals, excellent pictures, diagnostic even, so something that you can use to potentially help yourself identify. Find and identify. It's a heck of a lot of fun. And that's it for me. That's the presentation I wanted to share with you guys. And I know I went a little bit over time. I apologize.
No, that is quite all right. That was a very fun or illuminating topic based on the lamps at the end there. That was great. I really enjoyed that. I was taking notes the whole time. I feel like that's a very niche subject that especially like the urban forestry and arboriculture community wants more of, but is not presented enough to us. And it is so important to us, especially those people like Kevin. I know he works with groups and is doing some volunteer programs on like putting more fruit trees out there. And that could be a really great educational add-on for people to gain further appreciation for all these amazing things that you've researched and studied. So thank you. I thought that was wonderful. Now,
Thanks. I
Kate,
appreciate that.
yeah, gotcha, of course. Now, Katie, I know you've got questions. I had some thoughts, some questions too, but I want to open up the chat to everybody that has questions. If you've got questions, please add those in there, and Katie's going to walk through that with you all.
Alrighty. Before I get to those questions, I am going to share my screen, the QR code for if you're seeking those ISA CEUs. That way, that's up there. And then I believe Kevin is also going to put a link in the chat for you to see that. But without further ado, let me get to the questions. What's the reason that some moths are more active in the early evening?
That's a really good question. I have no good answers for you. I think when we're talking about a behavioral study like that, it's kind of hard to sort of motivations. How do you research motivations? It's kind of tough to say. Likely it has to do something with their diel cycle. They're just That's just when they're active. At this time, all we know is that they are more active. Some of them are more active, and you could probably find variants. And so, if you did the same study in a different region, you might see a shift in the species activities. It could have been time of year. I just happened to be out there when those moths liked the 9 to 10 o'clock range or the 1 to 2 range. It's tough to say. It really is. I'll say that one thing I did notice, and I didn't study, I didn't take any data, so I can't say with any definitive concrete evidence. um, the nectar production seemed like the apples smelled a lot more fragrant when I first got out there. And so the first part of the evening, it was pretty fragrant. And I think that probably had something to do with drawing in animals from pretty long distances. But short answer, don't know. We don't know. We're not sure.
Thank you. Next question. Are moth caterpillars also more active at dusk or night?
Interestingly, some of them are, but not all of them. And so even those animals that are as adults exclusively active nocturnally. You can see those feeding on plants in the middle of the day. They probably do some of their rest at night. Now, some of that has to do, and there's going to be shifts, right? Some of that has to do with predation, the time that they're actually active. When are those predators out there? If they're out there and super active during a period, it is actually better to avoid that. What about the plant resources? When are they best? And we know from loads of plant studies. Most of the nutrients, most of the water content in plants is present at the beginning of the day, and it decreases throughout the day until you get that evening temperature to sort of get those plants some rest to be able to focus on that conservation. So it depends, but I would say they're active equally, both dusk and or both day and night. Just depends on the species.
Okay, thank you. What are your thoughts on wildfire smoke affecting moths?
Well, we know for certain that wildfires, it's been a very common use. So we would use wildfire, we'd burn sulfur, we'd burn wood next to or adjacent to agricultural fields. It's a repellent. And so undoubtedly the concentration of smoke can disrupt their ability to sense the things that they're after. And so it could be disruptive all the way to completely deleterious. They can't find their way. Maybe they're even getting choked out. So I would say that those wildfires could have a pretty prominent effect.
How many generations on average per year in terms of life cycle?
Again, that one's going to depend on the animal itself. The that Methema unipuncta, the true armyworm, can go through 4 different generations within a summer. depending on where it is, especially in the south where temperatures are conducive to development. Up here in the north, we often get two broods of some of the more common moth species, depends on what it is, right? Um, but then they also have, if you're familiar with monarchs, their super brood. There is a brood at the end of the fall season where temperatures start to decline. They need to migrate back southward. And so we do have super generations of moths that move down into Mexico, kind of similar to what the monarchs do. But um, lifespans vary based on the time of year, but we get about a month, 2 months out of most of these species, and their reproduction is going to be 2 to 3 to 4 broods, depending on the species and location.
Okay. Are night jars the best predators of nocturnal pollinators?
I would say bats are actually better pollinators. Your whippoorwill, your chuckwill widow. I don't know if you guys get those in Tennessee. Your common nighthawks. They're good pollinators or good feeders, predators of those nocturnal pollinators. Yep, they certainly do. But they're not going to. I mean, when you're talking about 100,000, you may have 5 night jars in an area. It's not going to affect their population, and it's good to support the birds too. Hey, if they're food, let them be food.
How far can moths pollinate and how long?
Oh,
Oh,
that's a good question.
yeah.
Yep. So that is an excellent question. Um, Gosh, it almost feels like a plant because that's something that I didn't really talk about, but something that I think is incredibly important. We have captured animals in Indiana, that had pollen from Texas. And we know that because it was a mimosa plant that's only found in the southern regions of the United States. And so we know the most northern port that they could have gotten. We did some genetics too. And so the most northern part of where that species exists, we found that pollen in Indiana. And so we're talking about a transfer of 1,800 kilometers or more. And so we've got animals again. And so when I said that an animal can visit an apple tree in Arkansas and then carry it up, if they went up to Michigan, it's quite possible that they carry that genetics and they are the pollen itself, and it's viable pollen, and then pollinate trees in Michigan. The compounding contribution of pollination is incredible for that. Also, the expansion of genetic diversity. So and this is really important in desert habitats where we're talking about disconnected kind of sky islands or ecological habitats that are separated by large distances of dry nothing. Moths will pick it up from one and carry it over to the other. So instead of having that genetic bottlenecking that I was talking about from habitat fragmentation, we actually have moths that are communicating between these greatly disparate habitats. And I have this theory that there's a specific type of plant that I think is probably pollinated on that migration climb, meaning that we'll see more commonality from southern species to northern species because the southern genetics are being carried to the northern populations pretty readily. It's cool.
Yeah. What sets moths apart from butterflies?
The biggest thing is going to be flying during the day, but we know that there are plenty of diurnal moths out there, clearwing moths. There's some sphingids that are active during the day. A lot of what you see in the differentiation is the bigger the wings, large, flappier, kind of sail-like wings are typical with butterflies. Butterflies tend to develop these little nodules, these bulbs at the end of their antennae, and Hesperia, they're kind of flat spoon-like, and a lot of them they're just like bulbs. But you see that developing in diurnal moths as well. So there's maybe some photo activity there. You also tend to see a little bit daintier bodies on butterflies, and they fly like they look like they fly terribly, but a lot of their lack of coordination is an effective means of preventing predation. So when they fall and flop around, and it's hard for you to catch it, it's hard for other predators to catch it. Moths are much better flyers.
I know we're getting close to the 1 o'clock, well, 1 o'clock my time, noon y'all's time. But there are a few questions left. Do you mind staying on
Oh
just
yeah, no,
a
no, no. I'm fine for as long if we keep getting questions and you guys are willing to stay on, I'm willing to answer.
Okay, great. And everyone, again, that QR code is up, and Kevin has also put the link in the chat if you need to confirm that you've been on here for those ISA CEUs. But next question, Are prairie strips effective and efficient for pollinator conservation fruit farms like they seem to be for corn and soy fields?
Yes. And so you can imagine, so we're talking about CRPs, the conservation reserve programs, where you oftentimes put up prairie strips or prairie habitat in order to counteract maybe the overuse of area with ag. Um, it works really well because, of course, we're providing diversity and floral resources for those heavily monocultured soy and corn. In fruit ag, yes, it is important because when we're talking about fruit agriculture, again, pests are the single biggest problem for fruit ag. You guys have probably seen the influx of spotted wing Drosophila, for example. These soft-bodied fruits are being absolutely destroyed by those animals. Japanese beetles, June beetles. We had serious problems with pests. In fact, for those seed set questions, I had to harvest apples way early. And the reason I point that out is because you're going to dump pesticides on them in order to protect your investment, and that's not good for pollinators. One, these moths move in and they don't stick around. They're not interested in hanging out. They're going to go to lay eggs, they're going to go to reproduce. Those sources are just energy sources to then do something else. For bees and other pollinators, they need those floral resources, but they also need habitat that's unaffected, nice, diverse. It provides the resources they need, and it's not going to be affected by inputs like pesticides. So, yes, I think they're really important. It provides a diversity. And if you guys know anything about fruit plants, their bloom window is oftentimes a week to 2 weeks maximum. There are some that, of course, bloom for a very long period, but a lot of cases, you're talking about a very brief window. If you want those pollinators to stick around, if you want the benefit of that diverse community, you've got to put up other resources that'll give them the ability to live beyond that 2 week window.
And I feel like you kind of touched on this, but next question, are nighttime pollinators impacted by pest control?
Absolutely. And it's like I mentioned, a lot of the recommendations that I see on pesticides are spray in the evening hours after 4 o'clock. If you know anything about diurnal pollinators, 10 to 2 is a very important window for most flying insects. It's not the heat of the day where they're going to get so overly exhausted and potentially die. Um, it's a nice window where the temperatures are good, the sun's out, they can be very active, and of course the plants are blooming at that time. And so if we go out there and we spray blooming plants in the evening, that concentration, while it goes away before the next day and those diurnal pollinators get out there, those nocturnal pollinators get hit pretty bad. And I can tell you that a lot of times the target are going to be Lepidoptera larvae. Moth and butterfly larvae are huge pests of agriculture. So a lot of the products that are targeting these moths that potentially are visiting and pollinating. So we need to be very careful about how we manage, how we steward the use of pesticides, and how we understand the pollination world, and of course, how we give information and advice out to people. I would suggest making applications never during bloom, ever during bloom. Suffer the losses. It's kind of sucks, but rough advice.
Which tree species are known to serve as host plants for moths?
Okay, that's a good question. I'll say all of them. So when I pointed out that there are 160 described species of Lepidoptera, Lepidoptera are one of the interesting groups of organisms that have a higher propensity, a higher percentage of specialists, meaning they focus in on, they rely specifically on one plant. So when it comes to tree species, almost every single tree is going to have a related or a butterfly or moth species that feeds on the leaf material. And as far as pollination goes, I'm not sure that they're specific for it. I think they kind of just say, "Oh, there's nectar here." In some cases, we've found that, excuse me, and Euponimuted and Galachiid, we know that they exude certain saliva that can dissolve pollen. So they do go after pollen a little bit, but when we're talking about hosts, we're talking about larval feeding sources, and every single tree is going to have an associate.
Are butterflies less efficient as pollinators than moths?
Um, no, so you have to know a little bit about the companion evolution between pollinator and plant itself. If there's a strong enough relationship, or say it's the only species that can pollinate, it may not be very good at first, but over time the plant's going to recognize, like, this is my pollinator vector. I need to be attractive to it. I need to have pollen that's conducive to its physical structure, its phenotype. And so you end up seeing this play back and forth where the animal itself is trying to get as much nectar or much of the resources that it wants from the plant. The plant is trying to utilize that thing. And so you get this nice evolution between these things. So it just depends. Like I mentioned, that heliconius, very important for passion fruit. It is the single best pollinator for passion fruit species. It's the way it visits, it's the way it picks up pollen. And so it's going to depend on the relationship. In some cases, there are plants that are absolutely dependent on a single species of moth. In some cases, there are plants that are absolutely dependent on single species of butterfly. So it depends.
Okay, and I'm going to make this the last question. This is also from Imagine. How significant is the pollination? Oh, goodness. How significant is the pollination role of eastern tin caterpillar and fall webworm moths?
I think that they probably don't do much. I did not collect any specimen of either of those during my study. Um, so don't feel bad. You can kill those things. It's okay to kill those things. Eastern tent and fall webworm are animals that reproduce in huge numbers. They lay large clusters of eggs. They're the ones that build those nets around the oftentimes the tips of trees. They can overwhelm trees and be very problematic. They're a nuisance pest. And in some cases, agricultural pests, depending on the tree they're on. Get rid of them. You're more than welcome to get rid of those. Yes, cuckoos do eat tent caterpillars, and it's cool to watch too. You'll see you'll see a cuckoo land, and to kind of get an idea of where they are. If you know web caterpillars, they'll flail around when they're confused, but that also gives away their position. So cuckoos will land and they'll actually influence that behavior so they can just pluck them out. It's really fun to watch. If you ever get a chance, it's cool.
Okay, I said that was the last question, but of course there was one more that popped up, and I'm going to keep this one as the last question because I think it's a good point. But he said this discussion revolved around commercial ag crop species, which of course is where research money tends to be. Obviously, the relationships between moth pollinators and native non-commercial plants are way more complicated and involved. Do you have any general comments or thoughts or observations about that?
I do. Those crop plants serve as important food sources for a potentially very important and probably used to be an incredibly abundant group of organisms that we know have declined. The extent of their decline over the past 200 years we'll never fully know because the research into it has changed. But as we've developed pesticides and as we know those, we're getting contradictions, right? We've got a place where they are some of the most destructive pests in our very important food resources, and yet they potentially contribute. And I think the message that I would share on that is that most animals aren't just always beneficial. Now we have bee pollinators that tend to be mostly good. Honeybees sting and they can kill people. So there's always a downside to these animals. There's always something to consider. And I don't like the extreme views of, oh, they're pollinators and that's all they do. They're also pests. And so they serve both roles. And my personal opinion is we've got to support them where they're beneficial, and we do necessarily have to tackle them when they're problematic. It does create this dichotomy of management, but it just depends on where you are, what your goals are, and what you need. And I think it may be worthwhile to explore a possibility of having large ag monocultures with the full intent of supporting moth populations. Hey, let's get them in there and destroy it so that we have a very strong population of pollinators next year for our ag fruit guys. Um, that sort of coordination requires unity across the board, and I don't know that I don't know that we'll ever get there. So where it stands is manage for your own interest. I say support the diversity, the group, um, and let's just hope that that stays. Hey, if their only food source is ag fields, we're definitely going to extinct them because that's where they reproduce. So Yes, it is. That's a confusing thing.
All right, well, we are at 110, so I think we'll probably cut it off there.
It was a good comment to end on, though, too. I think that kind of was a good summation of a lot of the things I think we were asking questions around. So thank you all very much for sticking around for the last 10 minutes. And thank you so much, Dr. Robertson, for sharing your time with us. If you can't tell, everybody's really interested in this. So if you've got further questions, I see that maybe some might have popped in there. Go ahead, Kevin. We'll kind of filter those to Dr. Robertson to answer post conversation, and we'll have this available to you guys in a few weeks. And hopefully we'll have Dr. Robertson back at some point.
I'd love to. I had a really good time. I put my email in there. Don't hesitate. Shoot me an email if you've got questions. To Tom real quick. iNaturalist has gotten really, really good. It's really, really good now. And if it gets it wrong, it has a community of folks that get in. I love iNaturalist. I think it's excellent. So
Heck yeah. Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for sharing your time with us today, and we'll see you in a month. And again, thanks, Dr. Robertson. This was awesome.
thanks for having me.
Bye.